All right. So, hello and welcome, everybody. We are here together with Beth from Winning by Design. It's the second episode of the Revenue Architecture webinar series that RevBrains and Winning by Design are organizing together between the months of March and July. This year, we're going to have 12 different episodes discussing different topics on revenue architecture. The first one was with Jaco, the founder of Winning by Design, where we discussed the parallels between SaaS businesses and the factories and what are really the comparisons that we can draw from there. So it was a very solid foundation that we put. And today and next time, which is going to be next Wednesday, together with Beth, we are going to discuss the foundational models around revenue architecture, the scientific models of revenue architecture. And Beth, I'm going to give her the word in a second, but Beth is fantastic. She has taught multiple go-to-market leaders and executives in the US market primarily. She's leading. I think you're the main or the only instructor in the revenue architecture course for the US audience. So she's going to reveal some of the secrets behind revenue architecture in a second. So hi, Beth. It's pure pleasure to be with you today.
Hello, it's great to be here. I'm very excited. I love talking about revenue architecture.
Right. So just to tell our audience as well, it's going to be 2 episodes that we are doing with you. Today it's going to be covering the foundations, really the foundational part of revenue architecture, because there are some just practices, rules that we need to know around that, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe some of the people in our audience already are aware of some of those things, but today we're covering that, and then next Wednesday, we're going to have more practical sessions around tips and tricks, around different advice for how really we can apply those models in real case situations. So I know you have prepared a lot of stuff. Maybe we can directly start right now with what's revenue architecture. Why is it really right now, 2024? One of the best times probably to start digging into revenue architecture if you haven't already. And then we can go into some more discussion and questions. So I'm adding your slides on stage and feel free to take it from here.
Great. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Jaco put together this whole discipline and context, like idea of revenue architecture and all this amazing content right before the SaaS crash, and it literally could not be more important, all of this approach, than it is right now. So I don't know how he knew, but what I want to start with is just what is revenue architecture? I know some people have heard about it, but I just want to set the stage and explain it a little bit. So what you're looking at here is a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. So why am I talking about bridges? It's because it really draws a good parallel about how to think about revenue architecture. So the Golden Gate Bridge was built in 1917, and it was the longest and tallest suspension bridge of its kind. And when you just think about the concept of building something new in a successful way, which obviously it was because it's still around today, the reason that the engineer, Joseph Strauss, was able to do that is because he understood the core foundational parts of a suspension bridge and the design aspects of each of those components, and was able to put it together into a new kind of bridge. And it's the same thing for recurring revenue businesses. They operate as systems once they get above about $10 million. And there are core principles that underlie successful recurring revenue businesses. And if you understand those, then you can start to manipulate them. So that kind of sets the stage about what revenue architecture is. So I'll pause for a second and see if there's any questions about that before I go into why it's so important right now. Sound good? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, it's very interesting. By the way, I don't see any questions so far, but it's interesting how some other fields, some other domains in life, in the world, have thought about those principles much before us.
Absolutely.
Industry, but now it's our time, right?
It is, and everybody knows who's been in tech and other fields as well. Actually, it's been a really dramatic couple of years, and what you're looking at here is this graph. From 2012 up to 2022, this is what the growth rate of SaaS looked like. Everybody was just pouring money into it. Money was inexpensive. You could build these huge companies. The growth rates were high, and valuations were based on growth rate. So everybody was wholly focused on that. The problem is that they were wholly focused on growth rate and the acquisition side of a business more than other parts of the business. And because investment money was so inexpensive, you could paper over inefficiencies and other things like that, so that then after COVID and people started cutting back on spending and all the other things that happened in the world, we saw this, and what used to work during this period is now not going to work anymore. So leaders in recurring revenue companies need to figure out how to handle this new world where pipeline is hard to build, win rates are struggling. There's all these challenges. People are watching every dollar. They have to run with lean teams. And one of the kind of go-to moves when growth rates and pipeline and all that start to slow down is we got to pour money into BDRs and AEs and discount more. And these are just common things. Let's cut CSMs. But that's not necessarily the right move right now. I think the thing to do is really put on the sustainability lens. So this is going to require dropping some habits that maybe have been built over the last decade, and instead shift to a more scientific approach that revenue architecture helps provide. We're using data to drive decisions, and you're focusing on your core products and your customer base. Retention and acquisition are also revenue streams, or I'm sorry, retention and expansion. Acquisition is one of three. So you have to lean into that retention and growth side and optimize what is working well. So when we think about just in general, as companies grow, they follow this curve. That's one of the principles. Recurring revenue companies follow an S curve when they're growing in a healthy way. And what you're looking at here is the beginning of that S curve that most companies would ideally follow. And the percentages up here indicate the number of companies that start from seed funding and go through an A round, those that actually make it successfully along the curve. And you can see how rapidly these percentages are dropping, right? Not many companies make it successfully along this path. And a big reason for that is because at every step along the way, as you mature as a company, you have to focus on something different. So it's very dynamic, and it's very hard to make sure that you don't fall off the curve because you miss product market fit, or you don't get go-to-market fit. You fail at scalability. Any one of these things, there's so many challenges and reasons why this is hard. And so really, we have to shift from this focus on rapid growth rates and scaling and, growth at all costs, and really need to focus on sustainability, which is where revenue architecture comes in. So the thing I love about revenue architecture is it uses the scientific idea of models. And so there's 6 models that govern the way recurring revenue companies work. Now, a couple things important to know about models. Models are not precision tools necessarily. They're diagnostic tools. So they provide an idea of what we would expect to see in certain areas of the company. And you can use them to ask better questions and know where you need to dig into what's going on with your organization. And the models work together. You layer them on top of each other. So sometimes you'll use one, sometimes you'll use all 6. And each one sort of has a function and a place. So I'm going to spend the rest of today's session mostly focused on just explaining what these 6 are, so that next time we can talk about how to actually apply them.
Right, and maybe I can just jump here. Also, next time, as Beth said, we're going to apply some practical methods on how to use those, and also give some tips. But also, we had some questions, by the way.
Oh, great! Yeah.
Came from it was before even we started. Just to tell you, Beth. So some people that are around 5 to 10 million, it's this kind of growth stage. So they were asking, are we going to discuss what's the right level of operations, order of operations? Where do we start? Because we know those models, but really, what are the first steps? So just to let those people know, we're going to cover that in the next minutes.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great question. So a couple of things to keep in mind. What's super interesting is when you're a startup, you don't initially operate as a system. You will, ideally, if you get to that $8-10 million mark, then the way your organization operates will move into being governed by systems approach. But before then, you're really just trying to figure out what works. And so it's all about learning. So while all of these models are going to be good to keep in mind, you don't really start modeling your growth until, first of all, past $1 million while you're figuring out product market fit. But even then, some of these you will need to keep in mind, but you won't necessarily be there until you get past that $10 million point where you really apply them. That being said, when I show you the growth model and some details there, you'll see what the first things are, the order of operations for moving along the curve successfully. And so that'll kind of give you an idea, if you're in that $5 to $10 million range, what you need to be thinking about and what the first things are that you'll want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Because, usually, of course, people know it as some kind of rule that at 10 million, usually you need to have a well-established process and really be applying this kind of process thinking. And after 10 million as well, you need to invest more and more in process as well. But I think for people that are below the 10 million range, starting from, let's say, around 1 or 2 million, they have already achieved product market fit. Right now, at least for those people, the mindset and, thinking of how really to get to the next stage of 5 and then 10 million, and really some kind of even if we are not using those models at a full extent, but like if we are operating with those models in mind, right, that's super important also for these companies.
It definitely is. And probably some of the biggest things to keep in mind when you're in that range is you don't want to rush scaling. You want to make sure you understand what the right things are to be doing in your go-to-market motions. And to your point, like you said, you need to keep the models in mind that you will be moving towards, but you don't want to do too much too soon. And that can be, that can be a knee-jerk reaction to excitement. You're moving fast, heads down. So just being thoughtful about it.
And maybe to ask you here, Beth, have you noticed, and maybe to share with our audience, any kind of mistakes that you see with people applying those models early? Any specific examples on that?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see that a lot. We see probably the two most common mistakes are to try to scale too early and act like a mature company when you're just not there yet. And the other thing is just trying to do too much too soon. So if you're trying to speed up your growth and you're at $5 million and you have a mid-market SaaS product, you might say, oh, we sold one enterprise deal. Let's add enterprise in and start doing that now too. And then, oh, maybe we can, open up another region, things along those lines. But that really can dilute your attention and it ends up really costing you more in the end. Those are probably the two most common mistakes we see.
Right. Thanks, Beth.
Yeah. Well, let's run through the models and just get everybody a little bit familiar. I have different slides to show with each of these, but just to really quickly set the stage, the 6 of them. So the revenue model is going to talk about the different revenue models that you can use and apply to your company. You can run more than one. We'll talk about the data model, also known as the bow tie. The mathematical model is more a way to think about how the math works on different parts of the bow tie. We'll talk about the go-to-market model. And I think it's important to call out, when I say go-to-market, I'm talking about marketing, sales, customer success, and revenue operations. Really, all of those things together are go-to-market, right? And then we'll talk about the growth model, as I touched on. And the last model is the operating model, where we really start getting practical about, okay, how do we build the systems, the processes to leverage all of these tools and get things actually moving. So the first model, the revenue model, is pretty straightforward. You can see this arc across the bottom, and we start with pay up front on this far end. And the way to think about it is ownership over here, which starts with just straight up hardware, single purchase, you're done. Then you might have hardware with some support contracts or some recurring element, but it's really the ownership piece, that one-time sale, that's the bigger part. As you move into perpetual and then multi-year deals, you start edging into the subscription space where you have a subscription revenue model. And then you start going into consumption. You can think like Uber, where you only pay for what you use. And so a company is likely going to have one of these primarily as at least a starting point, but a company could absolutely have 3 different revenue models running. And it's just important to realize which one you have happening, because each one tends to have different win rates and sales cycles, and there's different amount of risks depending between the buyer and the seller, depending on which one you're running.
Right. And how do you see that? How do you see this model evolve over time? You know that in the past several years, we've seen a lot of companies that are using the usage-based revenue model and consumption. And of course, many companies are using some kind of combination, right, between the traditional subscription and consumption. Like, what's your kind of best prediction and observation for what's going to happen, in the future?
Well, certainly can't predict the future. Wish I could. But what I can say is that if you contextualize this across time, you can kind of think, even if you go back to like the 80s and 90s with telco sales and like multi-million dollar hardware sales, that was here. And then we got into the world of software where software was actually free in the early days, right? But then as that became the thing of value, we moved into this world of subscription. And it was really in around 2008 when the banks collapsed that this idea of multi-year software subscriptions jumped over into monthly because nobody had dollars to spend, right? And so like Mark Benioff and all those different companies kind of settled into, okay, instead of signing a 3-year contract, how about a 1-month contract? And we sort of settled around annual subscriptions as kind of a default there. But we also then started to see usage, but this is not new. You can think about ad sales, right? You write a contract for ads, but you don't actually pay until you use them. Cell phone minutes, right? Back in the day. We are seeing a rise in PLG right now, which tends to live more in this space. So I think right now, as there's more of a focus on this idea of impact, like people are really making sure the dollars they're spending are worthwhile and they're getting something from those dollars. We'll probably see a little bit more focus here, but I think all the models have a place and will continue to.
Right.
Yeah. So the next model, which is really pretty foundational, I'm going to start it by actually introducing this because before the bow tie was introduced, this is that classic lead gen funnel, right? That most people are familiar with, the classic marketing and sales funnel. So leads in the top, deals out the bottom. Fantastic. It worked for a very long time to model our businesses. The problem is that we kept using this model even after the world moved into where recurring revenue was more prevalent. But as you can see, even from this illustration, recurring revenue is not included in this model. So that's problematic if you have a recurring revenue business. An indicator that you might be using this model too heavily in your business is if you look at a board deck, and let's say it's 50 slides long and 48 of them focus on lead gen, lead dev, and acquisition sales. And then you have 2 slides on all the things that happen after closed won. So the solution to this is, it's not that this part of the funnel is not valuable. It absolutely is, but it's not enough. So the way to deal with it is to tip that on its side. So we have the acquisition funnel here, and then we have closed won or commit in the middle, and then you add on all of the things that happen after closed won, including onboarding and adoption and delivery of impact and renewal, and then to expansion. And what's noteworthy is in a recurring revenue business, you see these arrows. This is your growth engine. You get growth from closing more deals, but you also get growth from renewing and expanding additional deals. And so this side of the bow tie, as I like to say, which can usually include CS, support, product, crosses the whole thing. But all of these activities over here tend to be viewed as cost centers, but really they drive revenue, they drive profitability. So the bow tie is kind of the first part of the data model, just understanding that view of it. The second part of the data model, though, is this idea of making sure that you're using the data. So as you look across your customer journey, starting with all your marketing activities and all the way through, you want to make sure that you're identifying key points across the whole bow tie. And everyone, especially in the leadership team, is thinking about this the same way. And you're not overly indexing on just the left side. And you want to make sure that you have the right data points that you're measuring. So this is a busy slide. In the course, we break it down in a much slower way, but for the sake of speed, I'm kind of throwing everything at you at once. But you want to make sure that you're agreed and aligned on the volume metrics you're tracking, all the way from identified prospects and leads into interested and engaged and committed deals, all the way through, and the conversion rates across the whole bow tie as well. And everyone needs to be agreed on what the terms are, what you're measuring, where you're measuring, and make sure you have this data that's accurate and trustworthy so you can actually make data-driven decisions in your business.
Right. By the way, I'm going to put in a second the link to the new book that Jaco wrote on revenue architecture, so people can see it. I have the link that's also good for European orders, because I think on Amazon you just have it for the US. And
right.
I dropped it here. But what I wanted to say here, I think that, at least from my experience, a lot of people in SaaS, a lot of go-to-market people start using the bow tie and start mapping, the key moments, the life cycle stages, whatever you call them. The thing that I think still not a lot of people really get, at least in depth, is the piece with the mathematics, right? Which is your mathematical model. I guess you're going to speak about that in a second. So I think we are, in terms of like most SaaS companies, I think businesses already have adopted this thing, but the idea is still that I think a lot of people still need to realize how powerful really the second part of the bow tie is, right? And that if you find the right time, because of course, when you're a smaller company, of course, you need to invest a lot in acquisition, because that's how you first start to drive your business, right? But then you shouldn't miss, in any case, the piece where you directly start to invest more in the second part of the bow tie, because this is where the real magic happens, and Beth is going to show in a second.
It is. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when you think about it, it is not uncommon for a company to not earn any profit off of the first year of a customer subscription because of the cost of acquisition, which means that if you want to be profitable, you have to hang on to that deal past the first year and ideally grow it. And the teams that do that the most are the ones over here on the right side of the bow tie. And so the data over here is critical. And your point is great about the way the math works. I'm about to go into some of the mathematical model components, but there's another layer to this I want to just talk about. The math works differently on either side of the bow tie. And to me, there's two layers to this. One is the time horizons, just when you think about it. When you're managing the left side of the bow tie, we tend to think in shorter time horizons, quarter to quarter, quarterly goals. If you train your sales team, you'll usually see the results within a quarter. Activities you do, all of that kind of thing. It's very fast paced. On the right side of the bow tie, it depends on what your revenue model is, but let's say annual. You have an annual subscription. If you invest in onboarding or train that team, you're not going to see the benefits of it until the renewal cycle, which could be a year out. So most things that happen on the right side of the bow tie are, one, critical to profitability, and number two, take a while to have an impact. So it operates on a longer time horizon, and that's important because sometimes people assume things aren't working because they're using this shorter time horizon view and they're trying to apply it to the right side, and it just doesn't work that way. And similarly, the way that you can look at the math on the left and right side of the bow tie. So you might have caught on that blue is we're going to use to indicate acquisition side, the left side of the bow tie, and pink is the right side. So when we're thinking about just managing our businesses, there's often been this linear approach to decision making, and that's in the classic marketing and sales funnel, right? It's very pragmatic, it's very linear. If you want 2 times the deals coming out of the bottom, you put in 2 times the number of leads in the top, and that's the kind of decision making that leaders have to have. But actually, on that left side of the bow tie, if you're using the data model to track your conversion rates, you can actually just make small tweaks at various points all along that left side, and you can capitalize and improve dramatically, and the line can start looking like this. But you need the data model and you need to understand how the math is working. On the right side of the bow tie, though, things get really interesting and you get this hockey stick effect because the math compounds. So I talked about how revenue or retention and expansion are 2 of the 3 revenue streams you have. And so when you renew, if you can have a little bit of uplift, even like 3% year over year or bigger with expansion attached, that will mathematically compound. And this is what the line will look like if you're doing the right things on that right side of the bow tie. So just mathematically, you can really take advantage of the math if you can track the data and you understand how this works. Any questions about that?
Right. I think not so far. We don't have any questions. I guess we're going to have some questions at the end. And I know if we have time, sometime, I mean, in 10 minutes or so before we finish, we can even dive deeper on that. I know you have some more slides that are regarding that, right? So, I mean, around the customer operating model that you published last year and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And also, since next time in the next session, we'll go into a little bit more pragmatic things. If people are watching the recording, bring questions to that one too that are about this. That's completely great. And this slide continues to talk about the point you made, George, just a few minutes ago about the right side of the bow tie really needs to be taken for what it is, which is a growth engine. Because renewals and expansion allow you to take advantage of compound math in a way that you can't do on the left side. It is far cheaper to close expansion deals and to retain existing customers than it is to acquire new ones. So in a time like this, where we're living in, a time where companies are watching every penny and acquisition is slowing, lean into your retention and expansion of those existing accounts. And note that win rates and sales cycles also tend to be shorter for expansion deals. So a lot more attention tends to be the right move in a time like this on that right side of the bow tie. But you can't take advantage of it if you don't have a strong leadership on that side and onboarding and support and CSMs and AMs and all that stuff.
Right. One question, Beth, by the way, when it comes to the bow tie, when people start using the bow tie at first, sometimes they're looking for different benchmarks, right? Especially if they are, relatively new to the market and they don't have a lot of data. The thing is, there is a lot of benchmarks for the US market. Sometimes I get very often the question of, okay, how is it different, for example, for the European market? What can we kind of compare our data to? Because at the beginning, it's hard when you don't have a lot of, historic data and you don't know how to compare yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Benchmarking is such an interesting topic right now because we at Winning by Design had our own benchmarks for years that we had built from just years of working with companies. But the last 2 years, data just wrecked all the benchmarks. It's not the same world anymore. And so what we did actually is we partnered with a company called BenchSites, and we built a live benchmarking tool that you can go to online. You can specify your revenue model, your region, like all those different things. But here's the thing about benchmarks that's most important to keep in mind. First of all, you can't leverage them if you can't trust your data. So you have to have that data model in place. The second thing is that while you can look at those benchmarks to get an idea of how you compare, really the best thing is to benchmark against yourself. So you want to get that data model in place so you can start tracking your own progress and see where you're improving. It is good to know what a target is that's reasonable, but you want to be benchmarking against your own self in terms of how you're doing in the areas that will contribute to your revenue growth based on your maturity.
Right. And maybe if we can have a reference to what we kind of discussed earlier, the piece with having the right data, for example, for your bow tie model, is one of the things that you cannot wait to get to 10 million to start thinking about that, right?
Yeah.
Once you achieve your product market fit, you need to make sure that your CRM is set up in the right way to track these things. And really, you start gathering that data in order to have those even internal benchmarks as early as possible in your growth journey.
Yes. And so those folks who are in startups who had the questions earlier, if nothing else, a piece of advice, please follow. Set up your full data model, not just the left side, but the right side too, as early as you can. Because even if some of the models you're not really leading into and applying until later, the longer you wait to set up an accurate data model, the harder it will be because there's more data and there's likely more systems and you're busier. So I always encourage companies, before you get to that $10 million, get that data model set, invest in RevOps, make sure that you can trust that. And that's going to help you be a lot faster with decision-making and a lot better with decision-making once you do get past that $10 million mark.
Exactly. Yeah. By the way, I just dropped in the chat the benchmarking tool that Beth referred to. So if anyone wants to check it, you can find it in the chat.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Let's talk about the go-to-market model. This is really interesting. Jocko and a guy named Dave Boyce actually recently published from Winning by Design an article on Has SaaS lost go-to-market fit? This is probably one of the things that it's a very simple model. At least it looks simple. It is one of the hardest to execute against. And what the go-to-market model does is you can see here how it lays out. There's annual contract values across the bottom, number of deals per year up the left side. And you can see here that the gray represents your marketing motions, your blue represents sales, and then the pink represents the right side of the bow tie, so typically CS. The things that are so important to remember is just when you're thinking about unit economics and what makes sense, you want to make sure that you have the right go-to-market motions for your annual contract value, for what customers are paying for. You also need to make sure that your go-to-market motions are aligned not just with ACV, but with each other. Far too often we see companies where they'll have maybe a one-stage sales cycle and they're using account-based strategy for marketing, and they have just an online community or a help desk. So each of those go-to-market departments is doing their own thing. But remember, back to the systems point, once you get past 10 million, it works as a go-to-market system. And so it's really important that these go-to-market motions are aligned with each other, and that the unit economics make sense with the income you're pulling in versus what you're spending for that.
Right. By the way, because I have shown this model to some of our clients that we do revenue operations for, and very often I've received, because most of our clients are in Europe, and I've received the following question, because we see the dollar sign here, and they say, okay, if again this is for the US market, how does it change if we want to apply it for Europe? Of course, this is just some kind of how to say, ranges.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and great question. So first of all, I like to use this moment to reiterate the fact that, remember, models are not precision tools. So this is a guideline. What's most important, regardless of what regional amounts you're working with, if it's pounds, is it's whatever, euros, what you want to do is just figure out what the unit economics are that make sense for you. So the biggest takeaway of the go-to-market model is not so much that you make sure you have exactly the right go-to-market motions for exactly the right American dollar values. But what it is you want to make sure that you have the right go-to-market motions that are aligned with each other and appropriate for the spend that you are pulling in, and whatever you are spending for the things. And just practically, if you think about it, I mean, I think all of us have had the experience, at least if you've been on the customer side of a B2B tool, where your company's spending a ton of money for something, but the support is awful, right? And so that's misalignment right there. As a customer, if you're paying a lot for a product, you want not just great sales experience, but you want to make sure that everything after that is really strong too. And similarly, you don't want to use account-based strategic marketing and invest a whole bunch in that if you have a very low ACV customer that you're selling to, or having a very senior sales rep who's done enterprise selling really inexpensive ACV deals. So regardless of what region you're working with, really it's more about the concept of it.
Yeah, right. And I know you're saying until 10 million, you operate on one of those go-to-market motions. Then to reach 20 million, you add one more. And then to reach 50 million, you need to add a third one, usually. Yeah. But the thing is, I've spoken with a lot of people, and they say it's very hard, right? Because sometimes, yes, the theory says, let's do it this way. But then on a day-to-day basis, sometimes as go-to-market leader or as a founder, if you're in earlier stages, you start thinking, okay, but I know I don't need to be, and I shouldn't spread too thin, but am I not missing a lot of opportunities if I don't capitalize on, I don't know, as many as possible on those? What would you say?
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly. I'm going to show you the next slide. And one thing I will just state in case it's not clear is the idea is not to progress along here. As a startup, you don't have to start here. You can start with an enterprise product. Yeah. But to your point, whatever you start with, this is our growth model. And so you can see, again, the percentages I showed earlier and this curve. The part that's new on here that's really important is that as you are following along with your growth journey, And let's say you're starting with one product. Let's say it's a mid-market annual contract SaaS product, and that's what your startup is. What you want to make sure is that you are following these different breakpoints along the curve and they build on each other. And you want to make sure that you're doing all these things and that you have everything locked down with that. And then if you do want to introduce another segment, let's say you do want to launch enterprise, you need to go back with enterprise and make sure that check your revenue model. Is it the same or is it different? Is your founder involved in sales or do they need to come out? You need a new data model because a data model for mid-market product is not going to work for enterprise. They have to be different. So you need a new data model so you can keep the same, what you're tracking, but you have to track that data separately. Your go-to-market motions need to be different for enterprise than for mid-market. Your repeatable processes need to be different. So as you think about launching multiple segments, products, whatever it might be, you can go with one of these, but it's really hard to follow this for 3 segments at the same time and do it well.
Right. Something else maybe here also to mention, just to highlight it. I know you said it because it's also a common mistake that I see, especially among first-time founders. Like really, when you are changing something in your product, when you are adding a second product, for example, or even if you are going to a new territory, right, which is different than what was your original kind of market, you always need to get back and start from scratch. And it doesn't happen overnight, right? You need to invest a lot in those things, really in starting to think through every single step of the journey in order to reach these points where you are at right now in your most developed market. And it takes time. And just you need to plan for this when you are strategizing.
Yeah. And that's what we talked about earlier, doing too much too soon. And I keep citing segments like mid-market or enterprise, but your point is absolutely true. That's if you're launching a new product. It could be that you're launching into a new region. And if you've been established, say, in North America, and now you want to launch in APAC, you likely will need to have a different data model because the data is going to look different. The way that you go to market, your unit economics could be different. And culturally, what's required with different customers, a French customer might just have different needs as a customer than one in New York City. Exactly. And so you just need to account for all those things.
Right, exactly.
And that actually is a good build up. Like we were talking about being spread too thin. We've seen companies that have 4 different motions. This would be like a pro user license, a very small business license, a small and medium business product, and an enterprise product. We've seen a company that had this many motions, and then we're an $8 million company. It is going to be really hard to be successful at any one of these if you're a smaller company and you're trying to do all of them well. You just can't. And so the data shows that by focusing on one of these at a time and following it along that curve, and then when you're ready, then launching a second, whatever it might be, segment, product, whatever, then doing a second one, you'll actually move far faster doing it that way.
Right, and I think you've had some kind of research that you've done at Winning by Design that was showing how much more expensive is it getting when you're going from those more low-touch go-to-market motions to the higher-touch go-to-market motions. And of course, that's related to the fact that you need more people, usually more skillful people if you're selling enterprise. What was the number? Can you remind us?
I can't remember exactly what number you're talking about, but here's another thing I'll tack on to what you were just saying. Like, it is not uncommon to see, let's say you have a mid-market product and you have an AE who happens to sell an enterprise deal.
Yeah.
And everybody says, oh, great, look, we're ready for enterprise. And so that is now the scaling strategy. But you have to remember that sometimes in a different segment like enterprise, there might be different security demands of the product. There might be different features that are needed and all of that. I'm wondering if maybe the research you're talking about is what is cited in that paper that I mentioned, has SaaS lost its go-to-market fit? It might be in there.
Could be, yeah. I think Jaco even mentioned it last time, just I didn't.
Okay, yeah. I'm not sure exactly. We have a lot of different research, so I'm not sure exactly which one you're pointing to, but absolutely it is far more cost effective to do one thing at a time, just generally. Mm-hmm. So those are the first 5 models. That brings us up through the growth model. And just to kind of the things that they highlight most and things to just consider, that is where most companies tend to struggle, is how many products are you running at the same time? And use the data. Is any one of them maybe not making sense right now? Or if you're realizing that maybe you have too many, use the data to decide if maybe you need to wind one down or just put it on hold. Understand the number of segments that you have. And again, making sure the go-to-market motions, do they make sense? And you can see if you step back and look at the models, it's all very pragmatic and logical and scientific. And it's just hard sometimes when you're running a company to step back and disengage from the speed and the habits and all the things that people bring with opinions to the table. So just asking these very simple questions is a good step. How are we doing on time?
We are almost at time, but I think we need to cover at least a couple of more things in order to make sure we cover the fundamental things, and for the next time we devote it to tips and tricks.
Great. Well, we are at the last model, so the operating model. So this is where everything starts to really come together. And very often, unintentionally, we treat our organization as a group of departments and functions, working in silos, or everyone's well-intended doing different things, but this is what the customer journey and the organization ends up looking like. But what we want to get to is something that's more like this. And in order to really get here, you need the models I talked about, especially the data model, so you know what you're doing, and the go-to-market model to make sure there's alignment. But you need somebody thinking about the black line that surrounds the whole bow tie. You need someone thinking about the system, because it's usually not a problem that you have a leader who's not doing their job, as much as it is that you might have humans working in an unhealthy system. The system is more often the cause of the problem than any individual leader or IC or anyone. So this idea of an operating model is where this is where a lot of things come together. You can see the data model on here. You want to make sure that you've identified those key moments we talked about, and what's happening on the far left side of the bow tie. You want to make sure you're identifying the right kind of deals to get in the door. You're guiding them so that you know that you can deliver an impact that's meaningful to them. You need to make sure that that impact is tied to a business priority, and you want to make sure that the right deals are closing in the right way. And that once close happens, you have the key moments here for onboarding. What is good onboarding? How do you get customers to impact? How do you make sure that they're continuously getting impact so they actually renew? And then how do you get them to expand? And the best way to do this with the operating model, the points that it really focuses on, is that all the different things going on across the bow tie need to be interoperative with each other, right? And work together. You also need to make sure your teams have a common language. So whether it's bow tie, whatever terms you use for parts of the organization is less important that they match what I have on the screen. It's important that everyone's using the same terms and the same definitions for those terms. And you do need to make sure that you have a data model that everybody is agreed on and it's standardized and we're all operating off the same data. So when you think about the operating model, these are really the 3 core reasons and the things that drive that operating model.
Right. And by the way, if we can get back to the piece with where you were showing a lot of methodologies, a lot of different tools, and these specific things. So my question is, from my experience, when I start, for example, working and consulting on revenue operations, a company, like very often there is big mess, right? Due to the fact that like people are using different methodologies, different tools, and so on. So I very rarely come to see a company that has grown since the beginning in this system-oriented way. So my question is, from your experience and from your perspective, is it usually the way that it happens? So usually, like at first you need to have a mess and then you need to put some order in it, or can you just naturally grow into this system way, starting from the beginning and then just expanding on this system logic?
Yeah, usually the way we see it, when you think about how companies start, like think about founders and those early people they bring in, Those people are like, they have grit, they're creative, they're working hard, they're doing their heads down, they're getting things done, right? And the people who tend to be really excellent in those startup environments, what do they tend to think about process in your experience?
Of course, no.
They don't really love it. And so you get to this point with these people who are so critical to the startup phase. When you get to that $10 million point and you have to start getting process in place, remember the growth model with those breakpoints along the side, getting repeatable process in place using a data model is important. And so you have to make sure that people who are in that startup phase can make that shift. So it's okay to have a little bit of chaos in those early days because you have to learn what works and it's going to require some experimentation. So hopefully you get the data model in place, you have a little of that chaos, but you're using the data to track within that chaos what things are actually working. But then once you get to that $10 million part, you need to start bringing the chaos together and leaning more into the data and work to get it to something like this. And that's why we see some executives who are just more suited to or prefer companies that are at different stages, because along that growth curve, when you're in different stages as a company, you need different things. So you have to be dynamic either as a leader, or you need to know, what stage of a company you like to work with, but there will be some chaos. And it's important to remember too, by the way, that even if you have a more mature company that looks like this, it is rarely anyone's intention. You can have the best marketers and the best sales team members and the best CS people, and everyone's so well intended and doing really good things. The problem is that they are just not doing them in a fashion where it's all interoperable and linked together, and they have their heads up looking at the whole system. I just like to call that out because it's never a problem that people want to create chaos.
Right, and it's the truth is a very different skill set, right? To get to 10 million and after that, but still there are some people that manage to kind of adapt and lead the company up to 10 million and beyond.
Yeah, and beyond, absolutely. But those people are flexing,
yes,
and they're dynamic along with the company.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So let's see. So we can get into, so the next things I was going to talk about were really about one of the more core pragmatic things that I believe you need to center everyone in the company on across the whole bow tie is this idea of impact. And when we talk about impact, I just want to call out that there's really two components to it. When I say impact, it is me getting the value from your product or service in a way that justifies the dollars that I'm giving you for it. But there's actually two kinds of impact, which is important. Very often when we think about impact, we think about features, but it's actually more about what does that feature do for us? And there is a rational part to it, which is really what people think about first: reduce cost, increase revenue, reducing time. It's all that measurable stuff, which is important. But as humans, we actually tend to operate from a more emotional place. And so emotional impact sometimes is more important to be aware of. And emotional impact is a little bit more focused on the individual than the prospect or customer as a whole. But it could be if I'm the champion, and let's say I just started in my role as a CRO, and I want to bring your tool in, and it's my first 6 months. It is really important to me that this makes me look good and that this is successful. And so you as the vendor being aware of that and knowing that that is a really important emotional impact for me as your champion, that's huge. It is also important that you understand all the rational impacts that you're going to help me achieve and that I can use that to sell upwards. But these emotional impacts, a tool that makes it easier for developers to quickly check code for bugs, stuff like that. Those are really important. So centering everyone in the organization on recognizing and identifying these impacts is important, because at the end of the day, at this time in the world where everyone is so careful with their spend, everyone needs to make sure that there is true value that's meaningful out of every dollar they're spending. So your marketing team needs to know what that is, your sales team, your onboarding team, your CSMs, your AMs, all your executives. What impact do you provide? And build all of your key moments around identifying and delivering that impact.
Right.
That was the last slide.
Right. All right. Maybe one last chance to give our audience the opportunity to ask questions. Of course, you can think of some questions and ask us next time as well. I think next time is going to be also very useful, especially for the people that are on the revenue operations end, because we are going to give some tactics on, and not just tactics, but just some kind of common mistakes that we see in analyzing, for example, the bow tie, and a lot of practical stuff.
Yeah.
And what I'm thinking about, Beth, we can also collect some questions in advance for next time. So
Absolutely.
we will focus, some parts of our conversations on questions that people from our audience have. But if we don't have any questions, it was a real pleasure for me to be with you in this almost an hour. Right.
I know. Yeah. It's always fun to talk about this. And next time is great because these models and the concept of revenue architecture often can be pretty eye-opening for people. But it's one thing to understand the models and concepts, and then you turn your attention to your business and say, ooh, where do I begin? Like, what do I do with this now? So next time we'll get into that because that's a whole other thing.
Exactly. I've seen very often, it's happened with me before, and I've seen it with a lot of people when they are starting to do strategy work, for example, or when they sit down and start analyzing their MQLs or their opportunities. So they know all the theory. Yeah. They have watched a lot of videos, so they have listened to us. But it's really one thing to know it, and then when you sit down, it's another thing really to apply everything, the tricks that come there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So hopefully people will watch this and get questions together, and the next time we can dig in deeper, and we can, of course, revisit any of the models if people have questions about those too.
Right. Well, thanks again to you, Beth, and to everyone who watched us. And looking forward to our next session, which is going to be just 1 week from now, next Wednesday at the same time. Right.
Great. Thanks. Looking forward to it. This was fun. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, and see you. Bye-bye.